They accused him of stealing diamonds he had never even touched. In front of the entire household, the man who had given his life to loyalty and labor was branded a thief. Elias Gray, gardener of 20 years, caretaker of roses, and silent guardian of the Rothwell estate, was dragged across the marble floor like a criminal. His knees struck stone, his ribs cracked under fists, and the world he had built with 2 decades of devotion collapsed in a single night of humiliation. The Rothwells, masters of wealth and reputation, watched in cold silence. Not a single voice rose to defend him. Not one servant dared step forward, and why would they in that house? Truth mattered less than appearances. Gregory Rothwell, the patriarch, had spoken, and his word was law. But the mistake the family made that night was not in punishing Elias. Their mistake was leaving him alive. For as the iron gates clanged shut behind him, as rain soaked his torn coat and blood dripped onto the gravel, Elias swore an oath in the darkness. He would not only clear his name, he would make the Rothwells choke on their own poison. For 2 decades, Elias had lived in the gardens. They were his sanctuary, his pride, his only identity. When the sun rose, it found him kneeling in dew-damp grass. When the sun fell, it left him trimming roses by lantern light. Every hedge, every lily, every climbing vine bore his touch. To visitors, the Rothwell gardens were a marvel of elegance, but to Elias, they were a living diary of his devotion. Gregory Rothwell often bragged about them to his guests. A man may build walls, he would say, but beauty must be cultivated, and yet Gregory never once spoke the gardener's name. Elias was an invisible hand, a shadow among blossoms. But invisibility, Elias would later learn, is both a curse and a gift. It began on a night of celebration. The Rothwells were hosting a dinner unlike any other, a parade of aristocrats, business rivals, and foreign dignitaries. The mansion glowed with chandeliers, music swelled through its corridors, and Lady Evelyn Rothwell wore her grandmother's necklace, a priceless string of diamonds that caught candlelight like drops of fire. Guests marveled at it. Some whispered its worth could rival the value of the estate itself. Evelyn basked in the admiration, her hand resting often against her throat, as if reminding everyone that the Rothwells were untouchable. But by morning the necklace was gone, panic spread like wildfire. Doors were locked, chambers overturned, servants lined against walls as guards searched pockets and trunks. Gregory's voice thundered through the manor. Find it. Find who dares mock this family. And then suspicion, as it always does, slid toward the lowest rung. Elias was pulled from the gardens, dirt still clinging to his gloves, and marched into the great hall. Portraits of stern ancestors glared down as if eager for judgment. Gregory stood at the center, his fists clenched, his face red with fury. "Yo, you," he growled, his eyes narrowing on Elias. "You were near the terrace last night. You move freely. No one notices you. Tell me, did you think your years of service gave you the right to steal?" The word struck Elias harder than any fist. For a moment, he could not breathe. He had given them his youth, his strength, his very soul, and in return, they named him a thief. "You, my lord," Elias stammered, his voice trembling but clear. "I swear by the life I've lived, I touched nothing. 20 years I have served you, 20 years of loyalty." "Kill lies!" Gregory roared, cutting him off. "Search him." And hands seized him, guards tore at his coat, overturned his satchel, emptied his pockets. Nothing was found, of course, because Elias was no thief, but Gregory's mind was not seeking truth. He was seeking a scapegoat. "Thief," Gregory spat, his voice carrying so all the servants and guests could hear. "Do you think the Rothwells will be mocked? Do you think the world will whisper that we cannot guard our treasures?" Elias opened his mouth to protest, but a fist silenced him. Another followed. He fell to the marble, blood blooming from his lip. Boots struck his ribs, splitting skin, bruising bone. The hall echoed with each blow. Servants turned their faces away. A few wept quietly, but none dared speak. To defend Elias was to challenge Gregory himself, and no one risked the wrath of a Rothwell. By the time they were done, Elias could barely stand. Gregory waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. "Throw him out. Let him rot with the filth where he belongs." The guards dragged him through the corridors he had once walked with quiet pride, past the ballroom where he had decorated tables with roses, past the library where he had polished wood with his own cloth, past the windows that opened to gardens that were his very heart, and then the gates, the iron gates of the Rothwell estate, shutting with a clang that rang like a death sentence. No, he was cast out with nothing but a torn coat, bloodied hands, and a name now stained beyond repair. A rain fell as Elias stumbled into the darkness beyond the estate. Every drop stung his wounds, every step burned his lungs. He reached the edge of the woods, collapsed against a tree, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt utterly alone. But humiliation has a way of birthing something new, something darker. Elias lifted his head. His jaw, though bruised, set like stone. His eyes, though swollen, burned with fire. They think I am nothing, he whispered into the storm. They think they can bury me in shame, but I will not remain in the soil as their victim. His voice hardened louder now, carried by the wind. I will return, not with roses, not with kindness, but with poison. I will plant seeds of ruin in their lives, and I will watch their empire choke on its own roots. And with that vow, Elias Gray, once the invisible gardener, ceased to exist. What remained was something far more dangerous. The world forgot Elias Gray. When the Rothwells cast him out, whispers spread faster than wildfire. Servants whispered of the thief who had betrayed the hand that fed him. Shopkeepers closed their doors when he walked by. Children pointed from the streets, repeating the word their parents had used, thief. In less than a week, the man who had built beauty for others was left with nothing but a name no one trusted. He drifted through alleys with torn clothes, slept beneath bridges, and felt hunger gnaw at him like a rat that never slept. But Elias did not die. No, what the Rothwells had killed was the obedient gardener. What remained was a man who had learned that invisibility was not a curse but a weapon. At first, Elias survived by doing what he knew best, listening. He sat near taverns where servants drank after long shifts, his presence so quiet that no one noticed him. He absorbed every word spilled in drunken voices, which lords were cheating their rivals, which merchants were laundering gold, which families despised the Rothwells in secret but smiled in their presence. He discovered quickly that the world was a garden of secrets, and unlike roses, secrets thrived in the dark. One evening, while lurking near the docks, Elias overheard two men talking about Gregory Rothwell's son, Charles. The boy had grown into a man, but not a strong one. Charles had developed a taste for dice and cards, gambling away sums larger than most men would earn in a lifetime. To the world, he was still the heir of a noble house. But in the shadows, he was drowning in debt to dangerous men. Elias said nothing. He simply filed the knowledge away as a gardener would tuck away a seed. Years passed like seasons. Elias moved often, never planting himself too deeply in one place. But wherever he went, he listened, he watched, and he waited. The Rothwells prospered on the surface. Their estate gleamed, their businesses grew, their name commanded respect. But Elias could see the rot spreading beneath. The patriarch's dealings grew darker. Gregory had found ways to evade taxes, silencing authorities with bribes and intimidation. Lady Evelyn, once the picture of elegance, sought escape in powders and glass bottles, her beauty fading beneath the haze of her addictions. And their daughter Margaret carried on an affair with a man she could never be seen with in public, an ambitious journalist who dreamed of exposing the very class she was born into. Elias had eyes everywhere now. He had befriended maids, merchants, debt collectors, even a few of Gregory's enemies. Each relationship was cultivated like a plant, watered with kindness, shaded with patience. He never revealed too much of himself, just enough to be trusted, and always he remembered his oath. I will not strike quickly. I will let them grow complacent. I will let them believe themselves safe. And when the time comes, I will pull their roots from the earth. Elias took on a new identity. With the help of a sympathetic bookseller, one of the few who saw through the false accusations. He remade himself as Elias Crane, a horticulturist who specialized in rare plants and exotic seeds. He grew small gardens for the wealthy, each one a masterpiece of design, until his reputation spread quietly through elite circles. And in time, his path led him back to the Rothwells. Not directly, not yet, but through their neighbors, their rivals, and their allies, Elias inserted himself into their world again. He would often pass by the gates of the estate, hidden beneath a hat, studying how the walls had aged, how the vines had grown wild without his hand. The gardens, once his pride, now looked neglected. Roses drooped, ivy strangled statues. Beauty had soured without him. It brought Elias a strange, grim satisfaction. Every revenge needs tools, and Elias was careful in choosing his. There was Thomas, a servant who once worked under him in the gardens. Thomas hated Gregory for dismissing him without wages after years of labor. He became Elias's first informant, slipping him details of the family's daily life. There was Clara, a maid who had witnessed Lady Evelyn's addiction firsthand. She despised her mistress's cruelty and found comfort in Elias's quiet kindness. Through Clara, Elias learned the names of every doctor, every supplier, every lie Evelyn told to keep her secret intact. And there were the debt collectors, men hardened by hunger and desperation, who wanted nothing more than to see Charles Rothwell brought to his knees. Elias never revealed his true intentions, but he guided them subtly, encouraging their pressure at just the right moments. Piece by piece, Elias built a network not of soldiers, but of whispers. He did not need weapons. Words, after all, could cut deeper than blades. One winter night, Elias stood on a hill overlooking the Rothwell estate. Snow lay heavy on the rooftops, moonlight painting the gardens silver. From a distance, it looked untouched, eternal, a fortress of wealth. But Elias knew the truth. He knew what the family whispered about in locked rooms, what they feared, what they denied. Now, he whispered into the cold air, as if the estate itself were listening. "My name, my life. Now I will take everything from you. And when I am finished, no one will remember the Rothwells with pride. They will remember your ruin." Elias turned away, his breath rising like smoke. Behind him, the estate slept. Ahead of him, revenge waited. The months that followed were the quietest and the most dangerous. Elias did not act rashly. He did not rush. He cultivated trust among those who hated the Rothwells, nurtured the discontent of their rivals, and positioned himself as a man too useful to ignore. He began planting lies as carefully as he once planted roses. To one merchant, he hinted at Gregory's failing businesses. To another, he suggested Charles's gambling debts were worse than anyone realized. Each whisper traveled, twisted, and returned like a thorn. The Rothwells did not yet feel the sting. Not fully. But the garden of poison was already growing unseen beneath the soil of their perfect lives. And Elias, patient as ever, stood ready with pruning shears in hand. Years had passed since Elias Gray had been cast out like a dog. In the eyes of the world, he was gone, buried by shame, erased by whispers of theft. But what no one knew was that Elias had been patiently cultivating his second life. Now he resurfaced, not as the ragged gardener who once bowed to his masters, but as Elias Crane, a refined horticulturist, a man of taste, and a name whispered in elite circles for his rare connections to exotic plants and his talent for transforming gardens into living works of art. He wore clean suits instead of dirt-stained shirts. His voice carried a quiet authority, his posture that of a man who belonged in drawing rooms rather than servant quarters. It was all a mask, of course. But it was a mask so carefully crafted no one could see the man behind it. And when the Rothwells came calling, they did not recognize the ghost they had created. The Rothwells were planning a grand charity gala, a night designed not for kindness but for prestige. Their wealth had grown, but so too had the competition of rival families. They needed spectacle, something that would remind everyone of their unmatched power. Gregory Rothwell wanted the gardens transformed into a paradise that would dazzle the eyes of every guest. And in his search for the best, one name kept appearing on lips and letters: Elias Crane. The irony was delicious. The family who had once destroyed Elias Gray now sought the artistry of Elias Crane. They wanted his hands, his vision, his expertise. They invited him back into the very estate that had spat him out, never realizing the serpent they welcomed through their gates. When Elias arrived at the manor for the first consultation, he paused at the gates, those same iron gates that had closed behind him on the night of his disgrace. The memory was sharp, blood on his lips, rain on his shoulders, humiliation burning in his chest. But this time he did not walk through as a beaten servant. He walked through as a man of influence, greeted with respect, his reputation preceding him. Inside, the Rothwells had aged. Gregory was heavier, his once commanding voice now forced and brittle. Evelyn, though still elegant, bore the pale complexion and sunken eyes of a woman enslaved by addiction. Charles wore fine suits, but his eyes darted nervously, the eyes of a man who had something to hide. Margaret smiled politely, but Elias could see the exhaustion of secrets behind her grace. To the world they were still powerful, but Elias could see the rot beneath their skin, and he smiled. Elias walked the grounds with Gregory, making notes on what should be cut back, what should be replanted, and where beauty could be sharpened into spectacle. Gregory, proud but greedy, hung on his every word. He wanted luxury, extravagance, grandeur. He wanted the gardens to scream power. Elias gave him what he asked for. Elias gave him what he asked for, all while studying the cracks in the family's armor. Charles the son was the easiest. Elias had already whispered his gambling debts into the right ears years earlier, and now, with a subtle push, he began introducing Charles to investors who were nothing more than lenders with iron chains hidden behind polite smiles. Elias ensured Charles was offered credit he could never repay, tempting him with the illusion of wealth while tightening the noose around his neck. Margaret, the daughter, believed herself clever. She thought her affair was a secret, tucked neatly behind locked doors and midnight meetings. But Elias had cultivated allies in the city's newspapers, and he began to ensure whispers reached the wrong ears, dangerous ears. Her lover's ambition to expose the aristocracy could easily be twisted into a weapon, and Elias, with the patience of a gardener, began arranging it so that Margaret's indiscretion would one day bloom into scandal. And Evelyn, the matriarch, the proud lady who had once looked at him as if he were no more than dirt beneath her shoes. Elias had learned of her weakness long ago, the powders, the bottles, the desperate need to escape reality. Now he fed that weakness carefully, discreetly, through a trusted confidant. He ensured she had what she craved, but only in measures that deepened her dependence. A flower wilts faster when overwatered. They did not see his hand in any of it. To them, Elias Crane was simply the brilliant horticulturist creating a paradise for their gala. But beneath the roses he planted, he sowed thorns, and soon those thorns would pierce. There was a moment one evening when Elias stood at the edge of the estate gardens, watching the family gather on the balcony above. From where he stood, he could hear the rise and fall of their voices, the small arguments, the laughter that sounded hollow, the silences heavy with resentment. Gregory berated Charles for spending too freely. Evelyn excused herself early, her hands trembling. Margaret pretended to read, her eyes flicking often toward the lane where her lover might arrive. To any outsider, it was a family of power and grace. To Elias, it was a house already burning from within, though the flames had yet to be seen. He thought of the night they had beaten him, of the way Gregory had spat the word thief like poison, of how no one had defended him, and in that moment, standing in the shadows of the garden he once loved, Elias felt no remorse for what he was doing. They planted this poison themselves, he thought. I am only the gardener who tends it. The consequences began subtly, almost invisibly, like a thorn prick that drew only a drop of blood. Charles borrowed more than he could repay. Lenders grew impatient. A single missed payment became 2, then 3. 3 slipped into his pocket disguised as letters. His hands shook at the gaming tables, his confidence unraveling. And Margaret's lover, emboldened by her secrets, began writing drafts of an exposé that hinted at corruption among the city's elite. His colleagues whispered of scandalous evidence. Margaret begged him to stop, but his ambition burned too brightly. Soon the wrong people would know, and her reputation would teeter on the edge of ruin. Evelyn's dependence grew more obvious. Servants whispered of her absences, her long hours behind locked doors, her short temper when the powders wore off. The more she tried to hide it, the more it showed. Each of them bled quietly, unaware of the gardener who had placed the thorns in their path. As the gala drew closer, Elias completed the estate's transformation. He filled the grounds with roses of crimson and white, sculpted hedges into shapes of grandeur, and laid paths of lanterns that would glow like constellations at night. Guests would marvel, and the Rothwells would bask in admiration. But what none would see was the deception beneath, the carefully arranged vines of destruction that Elias had woven into their lives. The gala would be the crown jewel of their legacy, and it would also be the stage upon which their downfall began. Eulelias, unseen, waited patiently among his roses, a smile curling at his lips. The thorns had pierced. The bleeding had begun. Ivy does not choke its host overnight. It creeps, it coils, it climbs unnoticed until one morning the proud wall beneath it cracks, strangled by something it once thought harmless. And so it was with the Rothwells. The seeds Elias had sown now sprouted into vines. Their strength was not in force, but in suspicion. One whisper, one rumor, one debt unpaid, and suddenly the grand estate that had once stood united now trembled on foundations of distrust. It began in the city, far from the manor gates. Merchants spoke quietly of Charles Rothwell's debts. Letters appeared in places they were not meant to be, ledgers showing the son of Gregory Rothwell borrowing more than his holdings could cover. Rivals caught the scent of weakness, and soon questions spread. If the heir is drowning in debt, how strong can the family fortune truly be? Gregory, always obsessed with appearances, could not bear the whispers. He called Charles into his study, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind them. The argument that followed echoed through the halls. Shouts, curses, the sound of fists on wood. Servants pressed their ears to the walls, carrying the story outward like pollen in the wind. Every retelling grew darker until allies of the Rothwells began pulling back. Invitations were rescinded, partnerships delayed, investments suddenly frozen. And Elias, standing at a distance, smiled. The ivy had found its grip. Lady Evelyn withdrew further into herself. The powders Elias supplied through Clara no longer dulled her shame, they deepened it. She spent nights locked in her chambers, curtains drawn, eyes hollow. Gregory noticed. So did Margaret. Whispers of weakness clung to the matriarch. When Evelyn failed to appear at a luncheon with influential guests, Gregory's temper exploded. In his fury, he accused her of deliberately sabotaging him, of caring more for her own vices than for the family's honor. Evelyn denied it, but her shaking hands betrayed her. The children watched as their father called their mother a liability, his voice dripping with contempt. And though none dared say it aloud, the seed of doubt had been planted. Was their mother's illness the reason the family's strength was faltering? In Evelyn, hearing the whispers even from behind closed doors, came to suspect her own children of betrayal, that they might speak to Gregory of her weakness to protect themselves. She grew paranoid, clutching her vials of powder like weapons, retreating deeper into isolation. Meanwhile, Margaret's lover, the journalist with ambition too great for discretion, found his words on the edge of publication. Drafts of his exposé circled quietly among his colleagues. They hinted at corruption, bribery, even at the possibility that the Rothwells were evading the law. The rumors reached Gregory's ears. His fury turned to suspicion Margaret. Only she had the intimacy to provide such details. Only she could have betrayed the family to a man who sought to destroy them. He confronted her in the library, the place where she often sought refuge. His voice was low but sharp, like the strike of a blade. "You think I don't know?" he hissed. "Your betrayal bleeds through every word printed in this city." Margaret trembled, insisting her lover would never publish such things. But Gregory did not believe her. He saw in her silence guilt, in her tears confirmation. And so the father's suspicion turned his daughter into an enemy. While his family rotted in distrust, Gregory faced a battle beyond his walls. The government had begun sniffing around his dealings, tax evasions, bribes, irregularities buried in accounts. For years his money had silenced officials. But now, a new investigator pursued the case with a tenacity he could not control. Letters arrived at the estate stamped with seals of inquiry. Gregory burned them in the fireplace, but servants saw the smoke, smelled the paper, and carried the story outward. Soon, allies whispered not only of Charles's debts, Evelyn's weakness, and Margaret's indiscretions, but of Gregory himself, the patriarch under investigation. He felt the walls closing in, ivy tightening at his throat. And when men like Gregory feel the noose, they turn on those closest to them. Charles, humiliated by his father's anger, sought comfort in Margaret. But instead of sympathy, he found coldness. She accused him of weakness, of dragging the family down with his gambling. He in turn accused her of betrayal, of selling their secrets to a man who would ruin them all. Their arguments spilled through the corridors, servants scattering as their voices clashed. For the first time in years, the estate echoed not with laughter or music, but with rage. "Better a gambler than a traitor," Charles shouted. "Better a traitor than a fool who sells our fortune to strangers." Margaret spat back. The siblings who had once leaned on each other now stood as rivals. Poisoned by suspicion Elias had so carefully cultivated, Gregory turned colder toward Evelyn, his patience gone. In his eyes, her trembling hands and pale face were signs not of illness but of disloyalty. He accused her of weakness before the servants, stripping her of dignity. Evelyn, broken and bitter, struck back in whispers. She told Margaret that Gregory was plotting to cut her from the will, that he blamed her for every failing. She told Charles that his father called him worthless, a burden unfit to inherit. Each word soaked in venom deep in the cracks. Elias had not needed to invent betrayals. He only needed to water the ones already growing. The Rothwell estate, once a fortress of unity, became a battlefield of suspicion. Doors slammed, voices rose, footsteps echoed like weapons drawn. Servants tiptoed through the halls, carrying stories outward, feeding the city's appetite for scandal. And outside, hidden in plain sight among the roses and hedges he himself had designed for the gala, Elias tended his real garden. He watched from the shadows, silent, invisible, smiling as the ivy of betrayal spread across the family that had destroyed him. The Rothwells no longer trusted one another. They no longer spoke as kin. They circled like predators in their own home, each waiting for the other to falter. And Elias knew the time for harvest was near. The night of the gala arrived like the blooming of a poisonous flower. For weeks, the Rothwells had prepared every detail. Lanterns lined the garden paths, glowing like fallen stars. Roses burst in crimson and white, hedges cut into grand designs, fountains overflowing with light and music. To the guests who arrived in their glittering carriages, the estate seemed untouched by scandal, a palace of refinement. But Elias knew better. Beneath the roses, thorns waited. Beneath the music, silence sharpened its blade. Tonight, every seed he had planted would come to fruit, and the harvest would be bitter. He stood in the shadows of the garden he had crafted, unseen, yet everywhere. The mask of Elias Crane, respected horticulturist, was flawless. No one suspected the truth, that the very man they once cast out had returned to orchestrate this night of ruin. The grand hall shimmered with chandeliers. Silk gowns swept across marble floors. Laughter rose, glasses clinked, and the Rothwells basked in their guests' admiration. Gregory stood at the center, raising a toast to legacy and honor. Evelyn, powdered and trembling but painted with false strength, smiled thinly at his side. Charles hovered near the gaming tables set up for amusement, restless eyes scanning the room. Margaret, radiant in emerald silk, lingered at the edge, her gaze flicking toward the door, as if awaiting someone who should not be there. They believed the night was theirs, but the ivy had already tightened around their throats. It began with raised voices at the entrance. A cluster of rough men, poorly dressed for such an event, forced their way inside. Security moved to block them, but their leader shouted words that froze the room. "Where is Charles Rothwell? The coward who owes us more than his life is worth." The music faltered. Heads turned. Whispers rippled like wind through the crowd. Charles went pale, his hands trembling. The men held out crumpled notes signed in Charles's own hand, debts so large they could sink a fortune. They shouted of unpaid loans, of promises broken, of threats ignored. Guests gasped. Rivals smirked. Allies looked away. And Gregory's face, red with fury, turned toward his son with eyes that could have killed. The heir of the Rothwells had been exposed as nothing more than a desperate gambler drowning in dishonor. As murmurs spread, another scene unfolded. At the edge of the ballroom, Margaret's lover appeared, the journalist, bold and reckless. He held a stack of papers, drafts of his exposé, and he read aloud words that sliced through the air like daggers. Corruption, bribery, tax evasion, the Rothwells, a dynasty built not on honor but on deceit, gasps echoed. Margaret rushed forward, trying to silence him, but in her panic, she betrayed herself. She clutched his arm, pleading in a voice too desperate, too intimate. Guests saw, understood, and their whispers grew cruel. The Rothwell daughter caught in a public affair with a man who sought to destroy her family. Gregory roared in rage, his hand striking Margaret across the face before the eyes of everyone. The blow silenced the hall, not in pity but in horror. A family once untouchable now devoured itself before its guests. Through it all, Evelyn clung to her glass, her hands trembling, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. She excused herself, staggering toward the balcony for air. Servants followed, but it was too late. Moments later, a scream pierced the night. Guests rushed to the balcony to see Lady Evelyn collapsed, her body limp, her face pale as wax. A veil had fallen from her hand, powders spilling across the stone. The truth was laid bare. The matriarch of the Rothwells, once the embodiment of grace, reduced to a trembling addict, undone by her own weakness. Some guests turned away in disgust, others whispered prayers, but all knew the Rothwells' dignity had shattered. Gregory tried to salvage the night, shouting for order, insisting it was lies, mistakes, slanders spread by enemies. He raised his voice, but it cracked under the weight of chaos, and then the final blow came. The doors opened once more, but this time it was not debt collectors or journalists. It was lawmen armed with warrants. Their leader stepped forward, his voice firm. Gregory Rothwell, you are under arrest for fraud, tax evasion, and bribery. You will come with us. Gas turned to silence. Guests stepped back, dresses rustling, shoes scuffing marble. Gregory's face drained of color. He shouted of influence, of power, of mistakes. But the chains closed around his wrists all the same. The patriarch of the Rothwells, dragged in handcuffs before the very society he had sought to impress. Called the dens ta kanta. The hall dissolved into chaos. Guests fled, whispers thick as smoke. Some sneered, delighted by the downfall of giants. Others hurried away, desperate to avoid being tainted by scandal. Charles shouted in rage, swearing he would repay, that he was no coward, but no one listened. Margaret wept in humiliation, her reputation destroyed. Evelyn was carried away, her future uncertain. Gregory struggled against chains, cursing his enemies, but no one stepped forward to help him. The Rothwells had not been destroyed by fire or blade. They had been undone by their own sins, pulled into the light by hands they never suspected. From the shadows of the lantern-lit garden, Elias watched. The roses glowed in soft crimson, their petals perfect, their thorns sharp. Guests stumbled past him without seeing him, their eyes fixed on the spectacle inside, and Elias smiled. For years he had been patient. For years, he had watered the seeds of weakness, trimmed the vines of rumor, nurtured the thorns of betrayal. Tonight, the harvest had come. The Rothwells had destroyed him with lies. Now they were destroyed by truths they could not hide. He turned away from the chaos, his work complete. The night air was cool, the stars bright. Behind him, the empire that had cast him out crumbled into ruin. Ahead of him, freedom stretched wide and endless. The gardener had kept his oath. The gala was over. By dawn, the Rothwell estate stood in silence, its marble halls echoing not with music or laughter, but with the aftermath of ruin. Chandeliers still hung, but their light fell on abandoned glasses and overturned chairs. Roses, once admired for their beauty, now seemed to drip with the memory of humiliation. The Rothwell's name, once untouchable, was already ash on the lips of society. Words spread faster than fire, the heir exposed as a gambler, the daughter disgraced in scandal, the matriarch revealed as an addict, and the patriarch, the mighty Gregory Rothwell, dragged away in chains before his own guests. It had taken one night, one Herod taken one carefully orchestrated harvest. And Elias Gray, the man they had once cast out, beaten, and branded a thief, was its silent architect. From the gardens, Elias watched as servants scurried like frightened mice, unsure whom they now served. Carriages came and went, carrying away what remained of the Rothwell's pride. Reporters lingered at the gates, their pens thirsty for ink, their eyes hungry for scandal. Inside the manor, Charles raged, breaking glasses against walls. Margaret wept behind locked doors. Evelyn remained in her chambers, unconscious, her body trembling from the poison of her own indulgence. And Gregory sat in a cell far from the estate, surrounded not by gold and flattery, but by stone and silence. The house that once stood as a monument to power now reeked of weakness. Elias walked the paths of the garden slowly, his footsteps measured, his gaze calm. Every corner of this place bore his history, the fountains he had polished, the roses he had planted, the hedges he had trimmed into perfection. Once this estate had been his world. Now it was his graveyard. Revenge had not come easily. It had not been the strike of a sword or the pull of a trigger. It had been patience, calculation, and silence. Like ivy, it had taken time to grow, to climb, to suffocate. As Elias stood before the great stone fountain at the center of the gardens, he remembered the night he had been cast out. The rain, the fists, the word thief echoing in his ears, the humiliation had burned into him like a scar. And now the scar had bloomed into something greater. Hey, they thought me invisible, he whispered to the water. They thought me invisible, he whispered to the water, but invisibility was my weapon. His lips curled into the faintest smile. The Rothwells had destroyed themselves. He had only guided the fall. By afternoon, creditors arrived at the gates. The Rothwells' debts, once concealed behind a curtain of lies, now demanded repayment. Guards, once loyal, abandoned their posts. Servants left quietly, unwilling to sink with a dying ship. Even the gardens reflected the decay. Roses wilted, ivy strangled statues, and weeds pressed through gravel paths. Without Elias's care, the beauty had soured long ago. Now it stood as a mirror of the family itself, rotting beneath a veneer of grandeur. For years, Elias had wondered what justice would look like. Would it be the sight of Gregory on his knees? The cries of Evelyn begging forgiveness, the shame on Charles's face, the tears of Margaret? He had seen all of it now and more. No, but vengeance, Elias realized, was not about the screams of his enemies. It was about the silence after. The silence that followed when their empire crumbled, when the mighty were reduced to dust. And the silence of the Rothwell estate was sweeter than any cry for mercy. As twilight fell, Elias made one last walk through the gardens. He touched the stone benches where he had once sat, pruning shears in hand. He passed the rose beds he had planted in his youth, now wild and unkempt. He stood before the iron gates that had once closed behind him in disgrace. This time he did not tremble. He did not bleed. He did not bow his head. He stood tall, his coat clean, his eyes steady. The gates that had once cast him out now opened quietly, as if in surrender. Beyond them lay freedom, not the freedom of a man forgotten, but the freedom of a man who had fulfilled his oath. Elias Gray, the gardener, was gone forever. Elias Crane, the orchestrator, the avenger, remained. Before he left, Elias turned back one final time. The manor loomed against the fading sky, not as a fortress, but as a tomb. The Rothwells' laughter, their cruelty, their arrogance, all of it had died within those walls. He spoke softly as though the stones themselves were listening. You took my life, my dignity, my name. Tonight I have taken yours. Your roots have withered, your branches snapped, your flowers turned to rot. The garden you built on lies is no more. The wind carried his words across the grounds, as if sealing them into the soil. Elias turned, and without looking back again, he walked into the night. Now, in the weeks that followed, the Rothwell name became a curse. Newspapers printed their disgrace in bold ink. Their allies abandoned them, their fortune dissolved. Charles fled, chased by debts he could never repay. Margaret vanished into obscurity, her reputation in tatters. Evelyn never recovered from her collapse. Whispers claimed she wasted away in solitude. And Gregory Rothwell, once feared, spent his days behind bars, his voice silenced, his power stripped. The estate itself was sold piece by piece, its halls emptied, its gardens left to ruin. Travelers who passed by spoke of the once great manor now overrun with weeds, ivy climbing its walls like the memory of betrayal made flesh. And among them some whispered a legend of a gardener wronged who returned not with kindness but with poison, who watched from the shadows as the mighty were humbled.